My name is Michael Fellows. I was born 24 December 1946 in Coco Solo, Panama, the Canal Zone. My father was a career naval officer, and at that point in time was assigned to the embassy in Cartagena in Colombia. And Coco Solo, Panama was the nearest Navy hospital to that area. So when it came time for my mother to give birth, they flew her up to Coco Solo, and that's kind of where I was born. Well, on my father's side, both he and his younger brother were Naval Academy graduates. Dad graduated in 1931, and Carl, his younger brother, who actually ended up being a big basketball star for the Naval Academy, graduated in 1935. But on my wife's side, they were 5 generations West Point graduates. In fact, they were out in this area, the Colorado territory, well, when this was still a territory. I'd always figured I would somehow get in the Navy and serve on a ship. Always grew up near the water, loved the water, but my eyes weren't great. And so when the opportunity came available to go to one of the academies, my father more or less said, "Son, you probably won't get into the Naval Academy with your eyes." But right at that same time, the Army's Academy at West Point had received permission from Congress to expand from about 2,200 cadets to 4,000. So they were scrambling to fill a lot of slots there. And they were a little more flexible in terms of allowing you to not have perfect eyesight. So I just figured, okay, I'll go ahead and apply there. And that's where I went. The advice my father gave me the first day, I mean, I'd never been to West Point. I hadn't even seen the place until the day he dropped me off there, was he said, it will be tough, but when things get tough, you just say, I will get through the next formation, I will get through the next day, and you focus on that. And I found I pretty much did that. It was really tough at first, but I was in good physical condition. I was sharp. Fortunately, in the squad I was in, there were always a couple other guys who caught a lot more flack from the upperclassmen cadets than I did. And so, I got through Beast Barracks all right. And then once we got into the academic year, I did pretty well. So it wasn't really that bad, at least for me. I always was pretty good in math. I liked engineering. I found physics was fascinating to me. And so I did quite well there. And actually, when I graduated, I ended up getting an Atomic Energy Commission fellowship to go back to graduate school. And I could have done that right after graduation. But for many of us, it was in the middle of the Vietnam War. And all of us knew we were going to end up going at some point or another. So, I just decided I'd defer going back to graduate school and go ahead and, get to Vietnam and do my duty there. When I graduated, in fact, all of us cadets, we could pick one of primarily 5 major branches: infantry, armor, artillery, signal, Corps of Engineers. And a few of the very sharp ones could go medical corps, and because they were going to go be a doctor. And so I picked the Corps of Engineers. I liked it because to me it was engineering. I'd have a chance to do that. But a combat engineer basically serves with the infantry. So your second function is to fight as infantry. So to me that really made a lot of sense. It could do something that I enjoyed doing for the most part. And the Corps of Engineers was also a lot more supportive of sending their officers back for graduate school. So I said, I'll sign up for them and never regretted it. I did not go to Vietnam until 1970. And part of the reason was the West Point classes, 67, 68, had suffered quite high casualty rates for young lieutenants. And so the Army was kind of saying, hold off a little bit and then go. So I ended up going over there just as I was becoming a captain. And that worked out fine because once you become a captain, you need to get a company command. And I'd much rather have had a company command over there than back in the States. So when I first arrived over there, actually we flew into Tan Son Nhut, and I remember it was late at night. As soon as we walked out of the door of the plane, you knew you were somewhere else, just from the heat, the humidity, the noise, the lights everywhere, the smell, was much different. And I remember they moved us into this big hall, and there must have been, 500, 600 of us. And you really didn't know what was going on. And essentially what happened is, as you checked in, they might say, okay, go out that door. You're going north, to Quy Nhon or something. Fellows, you go out that door. And lo and behold, someone, said, okay, fellows, oh yeah, right, you go out this door. You're going to the 25th Infantry. So myself and, a half dozen others trundled out the door with our duffel bags and stuff, threw us on a helicopter, in the middle of the night. They flew us up to Cu Chi. And then we just kind of landed, offloaded, from the helicopters. And interesting enough, as I was, heading off with the rest of the guys toward some building there, an officer came up who actually I knew, was a classmate of mine. And he said, oh no, come with me. And so I trundled off with him, and we walked into another building there, and lo and behold, there was my father-in-law, General Green, and my wife's father. He was the assistant division commander of the 25th. And I think I must have known that, but I just wasn't expecting at all to see him there. So he welcomed me. And actually, as I was coming into the building, my classmate said, take off your captain's bars. Because I pinned him on myself, because I just turned captain. And lo and behold, General Green then, in a little informal ceremony, pinned my captain bars on me. So it was kind of a nice welcome and stuff. But then from then on, he said, okay, off to your battalion. So I went off to the 65th Engineer Battalion. And, it was a good battalion. It was the divisional battalion. In a division organization, you have a combat engineer battalion. You may have some other engineer units for specialty needs, but then within that battalion, each company supports one of the brigades. So initially when I came in, the only opening they had was for the S1. That's kind of the personnel officer. So, okay, I'll do whatever I have to. I didn't want it right then, but so I served as an S1 for a couple months, and then the company command for B Company came open. So I took over B Company in the battalion. And then ultimately the division started going home. In 1971, we were well into the Vietnamization program. And so a lot of the major units there were drawing down and heading back to the States. And the 25th was one of them. But they left one brigade behind, 2nd Brigade, and we moved from Cu Chi down into the Delta kind of area. And so I stayed as the company commander for that company in support of 2nd Brigade. And that's kind of where I finished off my assignment there. The typical things we would do as a combat engineer was you were linked up with the different battalions in the brigade, and so wherever they went, you would go with them to help them if a company or so on was going out on a mission and needed a fire support base built for protection. We would go along with that to build that fire support base. We would be out there if they were traveling along roads a lot. We'd be out there to minesweep the roads. In a couple, well, one situation, we did a combat air assault into a jungle area where we suspected there was an NVA camp. And the way you did that was you flew a C-130 airplane over above it, and they dropped a 15,000-pound bomb, just pushed it out the back of the plane. And it would explode about 30 feet off the ground, blow kind of a hole in the jungle trees, because it's almost triple canopy. And it would be big enough that 1 or 2 helicopters might be able to come in there. So we would immediately come in with first helicopters with a platoon. And we would have chainsaws, demolitions, basically that. And we would come in, and our mission would be to expand the LZ by knocking down a lot of other trees and then running around, and anytime we saw what looked like a bunker or a tunnel entrance, we would chuck in a bunch of C4 into it. So that kind of would be the type of missions we would do. In a jungle area, you could, when we would build fire support bases, we would have to try and clear the ground, a good 100 meters out. Normally you'll try and pick a location that gives you that sort of space, because if it comes any nearer, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong will sneak right up on you. So, we're forever doing kind of clearing operations around, our particular fire support bases. And then, when we weren't out in the field with them, we'd be back at the, our main base camp area, just reorganizing, giving the guys a quick break and stuff, and then my role would be to go out and touch base with all the battalion commanders and stuff to learn what was the next thing coming up, what needs did they have. I'd make recommendations for what we could do to help them and things like that. So it was a busy time. It's 7 days a week. Although again, you're not constantly going out there. But the thing is, almost all the young guys were 18, 19. I was 23, and the only guys older than me were some of the platoon sergeants and my first sergeant. But I never really had trouble with the men, other than when we'd be back in base camp and, there's kind of nothing to do. And, you got to kind of keep them busy and stuff. But to me, I just really kind of enjoyed it. You'd go around at night, if we're out in the perimeter, and I'd go around to each of the battle positions and stuff at night and visit with the men, and I'd bring coffee or something, and you get a chance to talk to them, and they all want to talk about home and their parents or their girlfriends and things like that. And it, really was quite an experience. In fact, the fun thing, one strange thing about it, is when we first moved out here to Colorado, I was working with an environmental engineering company, and I was away on a travel for something or another, and my wife received a call from a gentleman saying, "Is this the home of Captain Fellows?" And my wife said, "Well, yes, but he's not a captain. In fact, he's retired and stuff." And the gentleman said, "Well, I was a bulldozer operator in his company in Vietnam, and I always wondered what happened to him." And he was very nice and said, he was impressed with me and stuff like that. And so he just said, look, I'm going to be up in the Denver area, sometime. I really would like to meet you. And so drove down. We had a great time, just visiting. I brought down a lot of my pictures and stuff that I had, and we kind of shared them. And ever since then, we'd trade Christmas cards and stuff like that. And sadly, he died about a year ago. But it just was quite something that, one of them at least even remembered me after all these years. The topography of Vietnam, and particularly the area we were in, it's not as if you had mountains, and then great plains and stuff. Around Cu Chi was what you kind of call, it's not the plains area, but overall the ground was relatively flat, broken up with lots of different fields, for rice paddies, clumps of big trees and smaller jungle and stuff. As you got more into the highlands area, then it became a lot more thicker, triple canopy jungle and stuff like that. But, we generally didn't operate in those. You were always kind of looking out for North Vietnamese concentrations and stuff. So, but, our military tends to travel heavy, in track vehicles or, with helicopters and fire support bases and logistics tails and everything. So, it wasn't a horrendously different terrain. Those guys who were further north from us, ended up with, some significant areas where the hills would almost come right down to the ocean, and you'd have very narrow kind of defiles that you would have to travel through and stuff like that. The biggest, challenge is you go from a very dry season to a very wet season. And the impact on the ground, which is a high clay content, makes it just very sticky. Trucks can easily slide off into a ditch, and track vehicles can get stuck and all that stuff. So, that was probably the bigger challenge for that. In the summer, it could be very dry and dusty. The roads are very much of a clay type material. You don't have a lot of gravel and things like that you can use to reinforce roads. So in the summer, as you're on roads and everything, it's just terribly dusty, just a red dust. In fact, the picture of me up on the wall, my whole fatigues are just kind of dust covered, not to mention me. But then during the rainy season, that clay soil turns to a real muck. And, it's one thing having bad enough, having to hike over it and stuff like that. But once a track vehicle goes over a road, just completely tears it up. So during the rainy season, we constantly were working on the roadways to try and keep them passable for trucks and vehicles. Every little depression where a stream ran would just become a raging torrent, during the rainy season. So one of the ways we would help get around it is we always carried metal culvert material of various sizes, typically 3 feet in diameter to 6 feet. And if you came to a gully kind of area where water was really going through and you needed a quick way of making a ford, you'd throw the culvert in there, and then with our bulldozers, push soil over, and normally we could get hold of some gravel from another engineer unit whose purpose was basically to create that stuff. And so you could spread that on it, and it would give you a way of at least providing ways of getting across quickly ford areas and things like that. It'd be extremely hot, in the summer. So again, you'd need water constantly for your men. And we had a couple water purification units that we could set up. but invariably all the chemicals that came with it were out of date by 5 years or so, and you could never get replacements for it. So we were always scrambling to, provide plenty of water, clean water for our people and stuff. And if you're out, in the boonies, you're forever eating sea rations and stuff like that. But every now and then a resourceful NCO would get back and pick up some beer and some steaks and stuff like that. So it wasn't probably quite like you envision World War II and Korea. We could live fairly well if we really put our minds to it.
How much did you have to look out for enemy troops where you were?
Not that much. The infantry took care of that. And they were constantly out on patrols. You're getting intelligence, of stuff that's going on. When in the division, you would get all sorts of intelligence in, both from MACV and from whatever you get local. And if it looks like something's brewing in a certain area, then we'll move out to attack it. And so, these would simply be operations to go on out, try and find the enemy, fix them, kill them, and then you'd come back. And that's part of the thing which made Vietnam, much different than Korea, and certainly World War II, and what made it frustrating, I think, to many of the troops, in that you might go out, you engage the enemy, you take a bunch of casualties, and then you withdraw. So, you're giving up the terrain that you won, with multiple lives and, effort and stuff like that. But you don't have enough troops and stuff to secure it forever. And in a lot of cases, the terrain is simply a hill, somewhere out in the jungle where they had a major support base. So, that would be the frustrating side. How do you show progress in a war that's just continual, going out, having a major battle, then coming back? And then after a while, the North Vietnamese move back into the same area, fix it up, and you go back out after them. It's a war many of us have spent many years and just don't even want to go back to revisit and things. But, ultimately in my mind, I think the South Vietnamese had a pretty good chance of surviving. But this gets into the political side. Basically, once we had got them to sign, and we signed the kind of the peace accord with the North Vietnamese, part of the deal for the South Vietnamese was for the next 5 years, we would provide them full support of military arms, and if the North Vietnamese attacked, our Air Force would come in and pummel them. Well, as soon as they signed it and Nixon was out, Congress killed it. It basically said, we're not providing any more support to the South Vietnamese. That's weapons, our ammunition, anything. And so it was a green light to the North Vietnamese to, well, let's rebuild up and go. And they knew, there'd be no penalty to them, once they initiated the final assault on South Vietnam. The one thing I ought to also mention is my wife, Becky. I met her actually down in Fort Hood, Texas, when I was down for training, and actually thought she was the most gorgeous thing I'd ever run into. But I didn't think I'd ever see her again, because Fort Hood, Texas. And then lo and behold, her father was moved from Fort Hood, Texas, up to have a year's assignment with the UN in New York City. So I was still a cadet then. So I'd gotten this little postcard from her saying, remember me, and my father's just moved up to there, and we're going to be at Fort Totten, so that's just down the street. So we started dating, and lo and behold, she married me, which I thought was great. But while I was in Vietnam, Becky was pregnant with our first son. And so she decided to go to the Philippines and stay with her mother, because her mother could stay at Clark Air Base. Wives of general officers could stay in the Philippines. And part of the reason was general officer assignments in Vietnam were for 2 years, where most of us dealt strictly with 1, unless you extended. And so her mother was able to move to Clark Air Base, and so Beck did as well. She wasn't authorized, so she had no authorizations to use the commissary or do anything. But she could volunteer in the hospital and things like that. And actually, what was kind of funny is when I was there in Cu Chi, before we moved out, occasionally I'd go up and visit my father-in-law. He would call up and say, "Oh, stop up," and I'd say, "Sure, sir." I was only a captain, and there's a, 1 star. And so he would come up, and he was authorized to call home in the Philippines once or twice a month. So he would get on the line and talk to Mrs. Green and all that stuff, and then he'd pass it to me. And I would get a chance to talk to Becky, which was great. But typically within about 30 seconds of us having a quick talk, someone else would come on the line and saying, "Who is this?" Because I sound different than her father. And so I'd quickly pass the phone back to her father and say, "Oh, no, it's General Green." And the guy was, "Oh, yes, sir." Oh, and so on. So it was, I was very fortunate. I mean, he was a marvelous gentleman, a great officer, just a superb model for someone. And I just kind of learned a lot just from observing him. Having grown up in a military family and marrying into one, did it help things a lot? Yes, definitely. I mean, I grew up used to moving, every 2 to 3 years. So that aspect of military life, didn't faze me. Becky grew up in a military family and also moved every 2 or 3 years. So she kind of knew what she was getting into. I think many of my classmates and stuff who married, a young girl, whatever, who had no exposure to the military, suddenly found a rude awakening, when you were constantly moved. The level of quarters, and certainly in many Army bases, if you were older, sometimes a little run down, wasn't the best. And that frustrated Becky at times, but, she kind of knew it. And I think when we initially were young, in that, because she had grown up in the Army and her family and all that moved, it wasn't uncommon wherever we moved, there was someone there on that particular post or place who knew her father or parents and stuff like that. And so you always were running into people you knew. And particularly with the Corps of Engineers, we're one of the smaller branches. So, after about 10 years or so, you'd start running across other people you had served with or whatever. So it kind of felt like a smaller community. And that aspect I kind of liked. I went over in May of 1970 and came back maybe April of 71. So it was basically a year. I could have extended, although, when I looked at what was going on, essentially all our troops were coming out. So if I went on to another unit, I'd probably just be there to help shut them down, then to kind of come back. And by that time, Chris, our older son, had been born in the Philippines. Beck was coming home. So in my mind, it just didn't make sense at all to extend. And so when my assignment was finally up, and at that time I closed down the company, wished everyone well, and I was the last to leave. I was able to get and it required some pull at senior levels, because I could not go to the Philippines. It was not an R&R area. But I was able to get someone, with General Green's help probably, to put me on temporary duty in the Philippines. So I had a nice set of orders. I went down to the, Tan Son Nhut Air Base, and they had a plane which normally flew to Clark Air Base, and showed them my orders, had my duffel bag of, the stuff I had, and hopped on the plane. And the thing was kind of funny. I hopped on the plane and suddenly looked around, and everyone else on it were general officers or colonels and stuff. And here I was, the captain, and I got some strange looks and kind of asked, "Oh, where are you going?" And I said, "Here are my orders," and stuff. And a couple of them knew General Green. So once I kind of said, "Well, I'm kind of related," here they said, "Oh, yeah, Mike Green, sure, yeah." So I kind of was accepted as part of the little crowd there. But I had a marvelous time visiting Beck and seeing our son and stuff. And then from there, we flew back to, the U.S. Although I think I had to fly separately from Beck, if I remember right. But we came back to the U.S. and I had a 5-year commitment. So I was going to be in for a longer, even if I wanted to get out. But I was due to go to the engineer advanced course at Fort Belvoir. So said, boy, that's great. Beck's parents lived near in Alexandria, Virginia, and stuff. So Beck was happy to be, back toward home. And to me, it was a nice break because, all of us captains who are going to the course, we're finally attending a course to teach you how to be a company commander. Well, all of us had been company commanders already. So, we finally were being taught things that we either knew already or saying, geez, that would have been nice to know. But that gave kind of a year break. We lived on post. And it just was a really nice decompression, get to know the family again. I think we all felt that way. And the other thing, too, this was the time period when the whole country was kind of tearing itself apart. And to us, it kind of gave us a little respite away from all of that. We were with a group of guys who really understood what we all had been through. And we didn't feel guilty for what we were trying to accomplish. I think in the end, it was sad for all the lives lost for this. But, we knew each other. We got along well. The stories we would tell each other in the officers' club or stuff were stories we could all commiserate and understood. And so it was a good time. And then, again, I looked at my career overall, and I felt I was always very fortunate. About that time, I could either go back to a unit, or again, now I had that Atomic Energy Commission fellowship. And as I was looking at what some of my other guys, my age and stuff were doing, they were going back to grad school. So I said, well, maybe now's the time to do that. And actually what kind of helped me is I could have just taken the fellowship and applied to a college and stuff. But I'd always thought I wanted to go back to West Point to teach. So one of the times we were driving up the coast to visit my parents, we stopped off at West Point, and I stopped by the physics department and knocked on the door and said, "Are you looking for any future instructors and stuff?" And the day I just happened to swing by, they were all having a party up at the department head's quarters. So I said, "Well, why don't you just go up there?" I said, "Well, they don't know me, But I said, okay. So Beck and I trundled up to this nice set of big quarters. Department head's a full colonel. Knocked on the door and said, "Hello, I'm Captain Fellows here. I'm getting ready to go back to grad school. Could you use someone in another year or two as an instructor?" And so they said, come on in, and had a great time at the party. And they said, okay, sure. So, at that point it helped because I had a group who said they'll take me once I got an assignment. Then all I had to do was apply to grad school. And so I applied to MIT. Part of that is my parents were living in Massachusetts. I think my mother really always wanted me to go to Harvard or MIT. So I thought, they got a good nuke engineering course there. And since I was fully funded, they kind of said, sure, we'll take you. Because they didn't need, MIT didn't need to come up with any money. And they'd had other officers in and found that for the most part we were much more mature than the rest of the crowd. We were pretty well focused on what we needed to accomplish. So I was very fortunate. I went to the nuclear engineering department and had a 2-year period there to get a master's degree in nuclear engineering. And when I finished that, then it was on to West Point to the physics department, where I had a 3-year assignment teaching physics. And I found I enjoyed teaching physics. And then during the summer months, we'd be sent off to do training for the cadets. I taught float bridge training and things like that. But it was an enjoyable period for us. We lived in quarters, which weren't right on West Point. It was up north a little bit. But we had a complete house, with friends who we knew and things, and it just was a very enjoyable period there. So by then, I was kind of a senior captain by the time we finished all of that. And so I was getting ready for another assignment, which now would be overseas. So I was pegged to go to Germany to a combat engineer battalion. And so at that time, you didn't send families overseas together. Normally the officer enlisted went first, and then as quarters came available, then you could bring your family over. And so I went over. Beck stayed back in the States. I think went back, stayed with her parents for a bit. And so I joined the 317th Engineer Battalion outside of Frankfurt. I was all set. I wanted to be an S3 and all of that, but they said, oh no, we got the job for you. You're going to be the S4. Well, that's the logistics officer for the battalion. That's the worst job you want to get, only because of the complexity and all the stuff in it. But as I got into it, I found, boy, you had a lot of power. The battalion couldn't run if you didn't have your act together. In particular, we would deploy once or twice a month up toward the border, as part of an alert. The Russians are coming. And we'd always have to go up there to put in all sorts of minefields and things like that, along the normal approaches we'd expect the Russians to come. But my role then was I had to go up to one of the big ammunition dumps and manage kind of what we call a loadout, which meant all of our dump trucks and dump trucks from a bunch of other ones would have to come racing through there. We'd load them up with mines and ammunition stuff and send them forward. So I found that was quite a challenge to try and manage. But, you become kind of a very close-knit group of people. One of our company commanders, Ken Gonzer, is a good friend, and actually a West Pointer too, and we're still stay in contact. The maintenance officer, Rob Wing, and his family, we live very close together and stuff. So their kids and our kids, we had 2 at that time, were together. Beck and the wives there would go off and go on trips and do things because we'd always be in the field. And so you just, really make some great friendships that last for years. from the various assignments you had. And we kind of enjoyed Germany. I bought a little Volkswagen camper van, and we had a tent. We still have the tent. And so whenever we'd be free, we'd throw the kids into the camper van, and we had this thick book which listed every campground in Europe, and basically gave you all the details. So we would just take off, and go to a campsite along the Rhine River or something, or down in Bavaria, or twice we'd go down to Brienz in Switzerland, and one time we took a trip up through into England and Holland, and one time down through Italy and up through there. So it really was quite enjoyable, and actually it shaped our two boys quite a bit. They became very at ease with traveling on their own through Europe and just other things. And I think became much more global in terms of understanding the complexities, in the world and things like that from simply being exposed to that. So anyway, we did that for 3 years, and it was kind of tough on Beck. I won't say I was gone a lot. She was dealing with, two young boys who were rambunctious and stuff, far away from other family and things like that. And so, certainly ups and downs and things. So by then, that was 8 years, 8 or 9. I was a major by then, so you feel great finally. You're earning a little more money and things. And so I came back, when we came back from Europe, you normally would then be assigned to a staff college. I was coming up for that. And I figured I was going to go to Leavenworth. Instead, they say, well, we got a follow-on assignment for you, but we can't have you spend a year at Leavenworth. Instead, you're going to go to the Armed Forces Staff College in Norfolk, because that's only 6 months. So, okay, we did that. In fact, the thing I just always remembered, the first time we were there, this first time I'd been on a naval base in a long time. And they had a reception at the Breezy Point Officers Club. Well, a naval officers club or an Air Force officers club compared to an Army officers club is a world of difference. I mean, talk about extravagance. So, we spent, an enjoyable 6 months there. We were just put up in small, quarters there, so we had none of the only items we could bring with us was a basic set of clothing and stuff like that. So no furniture and all. It was whatever you had there. And so it was kind of funny. You might have an orange couch, next to a green chair to, something else, really hideous. But it generally was, comfortable. What also was interesting for us, and it opened the boys' eyes quite a lot. Well, Chris and John were our two boys, and they were elementary school then. But those families who lived on the little base where the college was were sent into the inner city schools to attend. If you were on the main base there, you could attend the base schools and stuff like that. But I think a way of achieving some sort of balance is they use the military kids to be sent into the inner city schools, which were predominantly all black. And it was a good experience for them. The schools weren't that bad or anything, but to be in a totally different environment than, what you've ever been exposed to, I think opened their eyes up a lot. And I think helped make them more accepting of, people who are, look different and certainly had different experiences than we all had. But we were there only about 6 months. And then I learned the real reason I was sent there is my next assignment was with the Defense Nuclear Agency, and this was up near Washington, D.C. And this is a group who's responsible for testing of our nuclear systems to ensure that they can survive a nuclear environment. And the group I was with was assigned to develop several large pulse X-ray machines that were going to be tapped into the side of a large vacuum chamber building. And the idea was to test the nuclear survivability of full-scale satellites and warheads and stuff. So, you know, I had no background in contracting or anything, but they said, okay, you know, in 4 months we want you to put together a contract to go out competition between two major firms to develop a pulse X-ray machine. So it was a wild time scrambling around trying to understand not only contracting processes, but then what are the designs being developed, and then how do you judge them? And so it was a wild time. I did a lot of travel to the West Coast because both contractors were out there. And I learned how to put together a contract and appropriate structure and develop, you know, an evaluation team and give them the guidance. And we actually went through and developed all the things and got to the point where we were awarding the contracts to do it. And then the SecDef area up there decided they didn't want to do this sort of testing. And part of the rationale, which never was stated, but kind of came up later, was, you know, you spend a lot of money developing these new satellite systems, and they're becoming so complex that when you test a full-scale system of it to a large pulse of X-rays or other things, invariably something doesn't work. So what that does is it stops the whole program. You have to spend a lot more money than Congress ever approved. And so it kind of came out that they'd rather not know. You know, you know the system will at least work when you put it up there. You won't know whether or not it'll ever survive in a nuclear environment. But, you know, it just really was kind of eye-opening. But I learned a lot from the assignment. You know, first time we were able to be in an area long enough that we bought a house. Becky was absolutely convinced we were going to go broke, you know, because we've never had much money, you know, but here we were plumping down, I think it was $70,000 or something for a house, you know, and how are we going to live and everything. And she was quite right. Yeah, I was a little concerned too, but somehow we all did it and things. And, you know, it was kind of nice to have your first house that you actually owned. You weren't living in government quarters or a rental place or things like that. And so, again, as an example of how connections help, a good friend of mine, well, actually it was another West Pointer a couple years ahead of me, it turns out was the one who pegged me to come to the Defense Nuclear Agency. I didn't know it at the time, but it's a small world, and he was an engineer as well. Well, he was going on to West Point to the engineering department to teach nuclear engineering. So he was there at the time. And about the time I finished up at the Defense Nuclear Agency, he was getting ready to move on to something else. So they needed someone to replace him at the engineering department. So he said, well, why don't you get this Fellows guy? He's coming available. He's pretty smart and all this stuff. So I had a call from assignment saying, hey, the Department of Engineering at West Point wants you to come back and teach. And as part of that, you need to go back in and get a PhD. You know, and I say, huh? You know, it's the first time going back for the master's degree. I'd been out for 5 years. So, you know, your brain cells, you begin to lose a few things. It's been 10 years since I've been doing anything like that, you know, and so, you know, we kind of looked around and said, Boston, we kind of like Boston, you know, and stuff. So I said, okay, And the reason I said, we'll go back to MIT is, for one thing, I knew them. They knew me. And when I called them up and said, you know, if I had the opportunity to come back, go for a doctorate, would you take me? And they said, sure. Are you fully funded? And I said, sure. So I hardly had to go through much of an application process at all. So I came back to MIT again, knew a bunch of the professors there from the first go around, or at least they remembered me. And equally as much, I always got along very well. The thing I always learned, get along well with the admin staff, no matter where you are. They're the ones who are always going to be there. You know, if you can get along with them, they'll help you no matter what. And lo and behold, the same group were there that I knew the first time. So it almost was like coming home. And the other thing was nice, again, is because I was fully funded, all the professors wanted me to work for them, you know, to do their study. Oh, we got a great thesis for you, stuff like that. And I found when I was kind of going around MIT, because I tended to be older than most of the other students there, if I went into another department or something, they thought I was an adjunct professor there. So I was kind of treated as you know, not just another grad student there is groveling for money and trying to get stuff done. So I, again, was very fortunate. I came back, I linked into Professor Norm Rasmussen, who was well renowned for risk assessment studies. And he basically said, hey, I got a project you could work on. It was develop a risk assessment study for a modular gas-cooled reactor. I said, that sounds good. So other than, well, what was a challenge at that time is for me to go back to grad school. Beck had finally had the opportunity to go back to get her associate's degree in nursing. The thing we always kind of said we were dumb was when we first got married, Beck was a junior in college, and so she quit. And for many years, she regretted never finished getting her degree. And for a long time, you know, the boys were too small. We were moving too often. So by the time we came back and I was in the Defense Nuclear Agency, we finally were in an area she could go back to. It was the equivalent of Front Range Junior College to get her nursing degree. But she had one more year to go by the time I was due to move on. So we had a year where I went ahead, she stayed back, but still managing two young boys in school and everything. And, you know, and then I was up at MIT, and then, you know, occasionally could get back. But it was a tough year for her, but she did marvelous, you know, got her nursing degree, and then eventually, you know, moved up and joined me at MIT. The biggest challenge for me the first year is when you've been away from this for 10 years, you're given 1 year to get ready for the general exam. And this is a full day written exam and then a separate oral exam in front of a bunch of professors. You know, and about half the people don't pass that. And so I was worried to death, you know, and studied my buns off and did all right, I guess, on the written. And the professors kind of liked me, so I think I kind of was thrown a couple softballs, you know, for the oral questions and stuff. But I answered it and, you know, passed, and then spent the rest of the time working like crazy to get the, you know, thesis done. I did graduate, got the PhD from MIT, and Beck was in, the day I was doing my general exam, she swears she was in the Catholic Church in Arlington the whole time praying. You know? And I was kind of worried too, but in any event, so got up past that. You know, we had good friends up there that we knew from the first time we were there, so it was kind of nice to get back, and I was kind of near where my parents were living and stuff. And unfortunately, my father died, during that period. And the thing is, going back on it, I always respected Dad. He was a career naval officer, commanded destroyers in the Pacific. Never really talked too much about it. And it wasn't finally until I came back the second time, and we started talking. I'd meet him at the Navy, the Naval Officers Club, in town, and we'd just start talking, because you were now two career, military guys and I just was starting to learn a lot of that when, he unfortunately died from a heart attack. And that's why, again, now I have a lot more interest in trying to learn about the Pacific War and the two ships he commanded and things like that. The first one was the Gwin. It's a destroyer, Gleaves-class destroyer, built in the 30s. He, I guess, joined it pretty early in the 39 something, and worked his way up from being engineer officer to executive officer to, eventually commanding it. The Gwin actually was involved in some of the escort duties in the Atlantic early in the war, was transiting the Panama Canal at Pearl Harbor, then became part of the covering force for the Doolittle raid. In fact, I have a picture of my father in the Gwin and stuff in the other room there, and there's a picture taken from the Hornet looking aft over its stern, and there's the Gwin approaching it because they would refuel from the aircraft carriers. And then later, the Gwin became involved with battles in the Solomon Islands. Pretty much early on was doing escort duty, guarding the supplies that were brought there, but was involved in what they call the battleship battle of the Solomon Islands, 42. And his ship was only 1 out of 5 destroyers that survived that battle, and was shot up kind of bad. Stayed, went back, got fixed up, came back, and during the Battle of Columbagora, which was a little further up the slot, the Gwin caught a long lance torpedo in its engine room, and it was sunk. Then Dad came back, commissioned a second destroyer, the Twigs, brought that out to the Pacific, and that participated in Iwo Jima, I don't think Leyte, but Okinawa. But by that time, he had passed command off to another officer. And then, sadly, the Twigs was sunk by kamikazes off of Okinawa. So, but anyway, Dad stayed in for 30 years, and his last assignment, we lived in Italy in the late 1950s. Because he headed what was called MSTS, the Mediterranean Shipping Transportation Service. So responsible for all the ships that were transiting through the Mediterranean. Very much grew up in a Navy kind of environment. And the thing I can remember, although we're kind of skipping around a lot, is every time a ship came into port in Livorno, where we lived, Dad would have the captain and the executive over for dinner. So it always was a constant stream of officers coming in, and all of them pretty much at that time were World War II veterans, you could tell. And it just was always very interesting because the guys would come in, they looked exactly like you envisioned John Wayne, one of these guys, tan, kind of wrinkly, had been out in the sun and the wind forever. And I would just kind of sit there, and I wish I'd recorded this. After dinner, they would all kind of sit around and share stories and stuff like that. And it just was kind of fascinating listening to them. I can't remember anything now, but, I was maybe 10, 11, and old enough to kind of understand what's kind of going on and things. But it was just kind of fascinating, just listening to these guys. From there, we went back to West Point to teach, and there I was lieutenant colonel at that time. So I was the executive officer for the engineering department. So I did manage all the admin for the department, and then I taught nuclear engineering. And that I enjoyed, did that for 3 years. And then about the time I was getting ready to leave there, the Corps of Engineers, the headquarters, had this wild idea that they were going to approach the Department of Energy and take over management of what then was going to be the development of a breeder reactor program. But none of them knew what a reactor was. So I was called to come down to the headquarters of the Corps of Engineers to brief, to give, reactor, 101 orientation to them. So I made several trips down there and talked to all these GS umpty-umps, and some senior officers, saying, okay, here's what a reactor is, here's what's involved. And basically I was saying, I don't think you want to get involved in this. Looking at all the problems, the experts have just building these things and everything, I don't think that's our expertise in the Corps and stuff. So I didn't know, whether or not they'd listen. So when I finished up, at West Point, I was looking for what's the next thing to do. And lo and behold, I got this call saying, well, they want you down in the headquarters for the Corps as an assistant to their 2-star general. And so the way it's organized within the Corps of Engineers side, this is not the military side, this is the civilian side. You have basically military programs director, which manages all military construction and things like that, and environmental cleanup. And then you have the civil works side. And it's the civil works side which gets all the publicity and, all the big money goes there. But I was put in with military programs because this was the beginning of the Superfund program. And there were a lot of DOD sites out there, former DOD sites that have contamination, and some of it had radiation stuff. So I was brought down there because I could talk radiation and at least understood it. So I got involved there with managing kind of some cleanups and advising the 2-star general on what needed to be done and stuff. And that was interesting. You got a lot of contact with Congress and other high-level stuff. And then all of a sudden we lost the head of the Environmental Restoration Division. He was SES, civilian, kind of general officer thing. So they looked around and said, oh, fellows, he's there. Why don't we plug him in there? So I had another 2 years there when I was about done heading the Environmental Restoration Division, which unfortunately kind of came up at the same time. I was eligible to go to the Army War College, which I kind of wanted to do. That was in Carlisle. But they said, that's all right. You head this group and then you can do this by correspondence. And I was saying, what? And Beck's never forgiven me for doing this, as I said, okay. So while managing this whole big group here, and we basically managed all the environmental cleanup the Corps did for Superfund and defense around the U.S. and stuff. We didn't do a lot overseas. So that kept me constantly going. And then in between then, wherever we'd be going on trips, I'd be in the car reading these books, and trying to write these papers and doing this other stuff to meet the requirements for the War College and stuff. And so Beck wasn't very happy with that. And that's, for all practical purposes, it didn't do me a lot. But it was fascinating because, there you're dealing with issues at the highest levels, of how the military's funded, how decisions are made with Congress and all of that. So I kind of did that. Learned a lot of environmental engineering, and that kind of shaped what I did afterwards. My opportunities were more limited. I was a full colonel at the time. The slot that I kind of was looking for, the next one at the Pentagon or whatever, had already been filled because I was waylaid and other things. And so they kind of said, well, we really got something we'd like you to do, but it's overseas. and you'd find it challenging, you'd love it, and that time Beck kind of said, well, that's great, keep in touch, right? We're not going anywhere. We've done enough of this. So that was kind of when I said, well, maybe it's time to, say it's been a great career, look for something else to do. And again, it was a good place to retire from because I've been exposed to a lot of, different things going on, particularly in environmental restoration, and I felt that was important. And a couple good friends of mine who were retired colonels, also had been with the Corps, had gone out and been hired by some of these growing environmental firms. And one of them was a firm called James M. Montgomery at the time. And Don Hazen, who was a colonel and retired ahead of me, joined them and said, oh, they were a good firm. They treat their people well, very ethical. You may want to consider them. So I interviewed with a bunch of firms and then joined James M. Montgomery and said, okay, what do you want me to do? And they said, well, stick around here for a while. He was in D.C. Because the head of the group was making a decision to move from Pasadena, California, where the company was based. So he decided to move to Boulder for his group. So that's why they said kind of stick around. And so they said, okay, we want you out in Boulder. And we'd never been further west than the Mississippi, So we moved out here to Boulder. And again, I was figuring out, well, I can manage a project or whatever. But I started looking around, and every now and then they needed someone to volunteer to go off and do something. And other people didn't want to do that. So I'd be the one to volunteer. They'd lose the head of an office somewhere out there and they'd be floundering for a while. So I'd go out for 6 months and head the office and organize them and get them going. And then they needed someone to help integrate a company they bought into the firm, kind of get them oriented and stuff like that. So I'd volunteer to do that. And then they needed someone to go out in California to head up the implementation of implementing a new financial management system, which is a zoo. But I'd say, okay, I'll do that. And so I learned how the whole company operated. So when my boss was picked to head the whole Americas operation, he said, well, you know how the company works. Come along and be my chief of staff. So I said, that sounds interesting. So I did that. And then when he moved up to take over the global operation, by that time I'd learned how the rest of the company worked. And so I went and did that. And so for 15 years worked with James M. Montgomery, which became Montgomery Watson, which became MWH as they grew. And then, when my boss basically moved on to, become head of whatever, it said, hey, it's time for me to kind of move on. And so basically, essentially retired from them. When you move from a structured military environment out into the real world, the uncertainty of where your next paycheck goes up tremendously. And those for us, who had a pension, because we were in for over 20 years, you always had that to fall back on. So, if you suddenly lost the job because the company didn't get that next contract, you didn't immediately panic. You had more than enough, to kind of live on, and you were used to not spending a lot of money, so it wasn't that bad. Just looking back upon it, I'd say I was very fortunate. Enjoyed my time in the Army. Both boys, I think, thrived. It was tough for Becky at times, but it was real stalwart. An Army brat, kind of could adapt to anything. Our older son, Chris, whose uniform is back there, actually went to West Point too. He decided that's where he wanted to go when I was back the second time teaching. So it was kind of tough on Beck because she knew kind of what you go through there. And Chris entered in as a plebe, and in the evenings we'd walk around posts there and outside the barracks, and you'd hear the upperclassmen screaming, at the newbies, the plebes, and Chris and Beck could just envision Chris, with that. But once he got through beasts and stuff, he could kind of come home, visit on the weekend, bring his buddies. So we always had a big crowd of plebes, in our quarters, let him relax and stuff and things. But it was a good career. I enjoyed it, most of it. I have 2 grown boys now who are great young men and off on their own. And Chris just retired from the Army after 23 years as a lieutenant colonel, and now is working, doing kind of the same thing he was doing in his last assignment, dealing with cybersecurity and the infrastructure for the DoD Internet. He's actually now deputy program manager for a major program for DISA and stuff. But again, what we both knew is, he doubled his salary, just from that one move. Chris is married. They probably won't have kids. He's 44 now. But met his wife while he was on assignment down in Norfolk with NATO. And they both are very adventurous as well. Leah, who's his wife, was a crew on sailing ships down in the Caribbean, hiked all through Africa and stuff, and are master scuba divers, both of them. So they're just too busy out having fun and, traveling around.
What's your other son doing?
John is a freelance graphic designer, lives in Denver, married, has 2 young children now, Ryder and Zoe. He was always after me because I was always saying, John was always artistic from day one. I mean, even at West Point, he would generate these little comic books and sell them to the cadets and stuff. And then he wanted to go off to, college to study, not art per se, but kind of graphic design. And here was an old grumpy dad saying, you really ought to be studying engineering or something that will, really pay some bills, and stuff. And he wouldn't, and Beck finally beat me up and said, lay off him, and he's still probably not earning enough ever to, pay all the bills, but a marvelous freelance graphic designer, very adventurous, both boys. In fact, he met his wife. John was actually back in Switzerland, ran into a couple who had a little hostel up in Gimmelwald, which is a marvelous little town up there. And the family liked him and said, John, why don't you run the hostel while we go off on vacation? So he would come back in the summer, run the hostel for him. And one day, 2 young girls came through the hostel, and John kind of liked one of them, I guess, in particular, and started talking, and the young girl said, well, I'm going to CU to study whatever it was. And John then said, my parents are living in Colorado. So, he linked up with them, and they got married, and, rest is kind of history. I like the military. I like kind of the environment. I like the people and the stories you share. There's a commonality of experience that really, I think is missing and is hard to have out in the civilian world. We don't sit down and talk about it. Chris doesn't ask me, what was it like in Vietnam? And John, even more so. So maybe this will at least be a record for them at some point. That's it. That's my story.